So far, we've taken a look at some areas of media law that are likely to be affected by Brexit. But what about other areas that probably won't see much change? The reasons for this might hint that Brexit doesn't necessarily mean Brexit.
In the area of data protection law, the really big piece of legislation that's coming through is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. I think the first thing to note is that that will come into force in May 2018, so before Brexit is likely to take effect. What happens subsequently on any Brexit is to be seen, but it would seem very likely that the UK then wouldn't move away from the GDPR and go dramatically off-piste. It wouldn't be in its interest to do that. Why? Because of adequacy, the ability for the UK to receive data from within the EU after Brexit would be affected if UK laws don't keep pace and are on par with European Union laws.
UK media businesses will essentially have to comply with EU data protection laws despite Brexit. And the UK won't have the influence to shape these EU data protection laws, which we'll still have to abide by. And it's not just data protection where we might sense that we're still being dragged along on the EU's coattails.
The principles of EU competition law are now well embedded in the UK's competition law framework, but there is perhaps one area where UK competition law could depart following Brexit. This concerns restrictions which might currently be unlawful because they have as their object or effect the restraint of cross-border trade between EU member states. After Brexit, the UK courts could find that restraints that could prevent trade between the UK and the remaining EU member states may no longer infringe competition law. But the bigger point by far is that any UK media business trading anywhere in the EU will still need to comply with EU competition law, and even agreements that seek to restrain trade between the UK and the remaining EU member states might still be found to be unlawful where it adversely affects trade within the EU. Once it's outside the EU, the UK will need to ensure that its competition laws remain in step with the rules in the single market. But as with data protection, the UK will no longer be able to influence those rules. We'll very much be passengers.
Even if the UK opts for a so-called hard Brexit, with significantly reduced access to the single market, the opportunity to take advantage of this flexibility might be limited. Years of being in the EU means that UK law is the same as EU law in many fundamental respects, and in practice, it just won't be that easy to change this. Perhaps more significantly, some aspects of modern global trade just work in a particular way, so some standardisation is inevitable. To trade with the EU probably means we're going to have to play by their rules. We might find that life outside of the EU requires us to operate a lot like we were still in the EU.
European rules on workers' rights are so fundamentally embedded into the UK approach that there just isn't much prospect of the UK government seeking to rip up the status quo anytime soon. Any material change would be subject to formal consultation in any event. I guess it's more likely that over time the UK might decide not to mirror changes that have been implemented in the EU, and in that way we may slowly diverge. For example, laws that impose an unnecessary and substantial burden on businesses, such as agency worker rights, are more likely to be subject to change. But this change is unlikely to be quick or a radical process.
It's not just areas like employment competition and data protection, where breaking rank over key principles that underlie trade might be tricky. Back to those portability regulations.
We're already working with clients who are looking at implementing the new EU portability regulations and then examining what effects Brexit may have. If a broadcaster starts allowing its customers to access their services whilst abroad, can they take those rights away? The question a lot of our clients are asking is that good for the broadcaster or for the rights holder?
So the scope for the UK to develop its own laws, especially in spaces such as consumer media, is also going to be affected by developments in common practice in the EU.
So in terms of creating its own legislation in the future, I've already talked about the GDPR and why I think that's unlikely. That's the adequacy issue that I mentioned. The next piece of legislation that's up for review is the e-privacy directive, really significant for media companies because it regulates electronic marketing and a lot of communications activity. It remains to be seen whether the UK would want to go significantly off-piste on that piece of law, given that we want to be in harmonisation and an easy place for international media companies to do business with.
In some instances, the UK has been the driving force behind the development of EU laws, and in these instances, the UK won't want to stray from the EU regime.
So the UK has been particularly enthusiastic about increasing standards for collective rights management, and especially offering one-stop shop licensing for online music rights across Europe. The EU recently brought some of those principles into law in the Collective Rights Management Directive. Now, the operation of that directive will get quite complicated post-Brexit, particularly because it might compel UK societies to accept repertoire and represent it from foreign societies. But given that UK societies have been one of the driving forces behind that directive, we don't expect much change to happen in practice.
And in other instances, the EU has had little involvement in shaping UK law.
Gambling and gaming has generally been an area which the EU has held back from harmonising. Because of that, there's no single market for gambling and gaming services that the UK will be leaving. Now, of course, companies operating in this space will be as interested as any other on the wider impact of Brexit on the economy and on general areas of trade and law such as employment, immigration, competition, and so on. But none of that is particularly specific to the sector. The focus is more on the potential impact of Brexit on places like Gibraltar, which is an established gambling centre, including for many British companies, or for somewhere like Malta, which is a major iGaming hub. But as a sector which has experienced a fairly turbulent few years in terms of regulatory changes, I think that it will be looking relatively calmly at Brexit.
The same could be said for tax. EU VAT principles underpin UK VAT laws, so this is not likely to change radically after Brexit. Inevitably, there will be changes needing review, such as the use of the UK's mini one-stop shop and additional customs requirements. However, VAT is a component of the EU's digital single market strategy, so it seems more likely that the UK will continue to follow developments in Europe. For the gaming industry, Brexit should not impact UK tax policy, but focus will be on Gibraltar, because its legal status is being reviewed by the European Court related to EU laws. As for other EU measures, the reality is that many UK groups have substantial interests in Europe, so EU tax measures will continue to have relevance after Brexit, even if they may not become UK law.
So the challenge, in a nutshell.
The UK's done a really good job of creating a stable, attractive environment in which audiovisual media services want to be regulated. It's why over half of the broadcast services in the EU are actually regulated here in the UK by Ofcom. I can't help feeling that if we were to lose that as part of Brexit, it would be a pretty unintended consequence.
As the debate around Brexit unfolds over the coming months, we'll be keeping you up to date. We might still be a long way from any certain answers, but there's plenty to be thinking about. Until next time.